Earlier this week, the Commander Rules Committee released their quarterly update in which a massive change to the Commander ban list was outlined. 4 cards were banned: Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, Dockside Extortionist, and Nadu, Winged Wisdom. The philosophy behind this decision was described as the committee wanting Commander games to be slow, and that they view fast mana as being in opposition to that desire. Thus, the Rules Committee decided to ban Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, and Dockside Extortionist. Oh, and Nadu, but Nadu's not really the subject of this video. For the most part, everyone is on board with the Nadu ban. Good riddance, Nadu! Now, in the days since these bans were announced, we've seen the community descend into upset and outrage that honestly might be some of the worst in Magic history. In talking about these bans, I feel I need to address several hard truths. Obviously, the opinions expressed in this video are just that. Opinions, but I hope you will allow me to both make my claims and then back up those claims with explanations and evidence of where and how I drew my conclusions. Let's start with the first hard truth. These bans absolutely improve the Commander format. However, there's more to that hard truth because despite this improving the format, I strongly believe Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus should not have been banned. There are myriad reasons for this, which I will cover in just a moment, but another hard truth about this situation is that the way in which the Rules Committee handled banning these cards was categorically wrong. There were multiple missteps and mistakes here, including, but not limited to, not taking proper diligence to signal to the community that these bans might be coming, not consulting the Commander Advisory Group, and many more, which I will cover in more detail in just a moment. But despite the fact that I both disagree with these bans and have a lot of criticism about how they were handled, the community reaction of intense harassment towards the individuals on the Rules Committee, including an overwhelming number of death threats, is beyond unacceptable and in no way justified by what has happened here. It is fine to be upset with, and certainly to criticize both the bannings and the Rules Committee, which I myself will do here in just a moment, but targeting individuals with harassment, doxing, and threats of violence is absolutely shameful. There is no excuse for such behavior, and it needs to stop. And there are still more hard truths to this situation as, speaking of fair criticism of organizations and their decisions, I feel strongly that Wizards of the Coast should be criticized not only for creating cards like Jeweled Lotus and Dockside Extortionist to begin with, but for reprint policies designed to keep their values so artificially high that them being banned can cause this much financial hardship and distress. Had Dockside Extortionist been properly reprinted over the past few years, it being banned now might not have carried such a financial sting if it was worth $8 instead of $80. So there are many hard truths to discuss here. This is a complex issue, and I have a lot to dive into. As always, I ask only that you hear me out. Let's begin with the most important thing surrounding these bans. Over the past few days, the backlash that we've seen to this announcement has spiraled well beyond the realm of acceptable critique. The members of the Rules Committee, the Commander Advisory Group, and even content creators who are on neither have been harassed to such extremes that include threats of violence. The biggest target was Olivia from Commander at Home and Elder Dragon Hijinks, who serves on the Commander Rules Committee. The threats got so out of hand that Jim from the Spike Feeders, also a member of the Rules Committee, broke with the tradition of non-disclosure in regards to votes and revealed that not only had Olivia actually been the biggest opponent of these changes, but she had proposed instead a course of action that I think the majority of Magic players would have found a lot more agreeable. Banning only Nadu and Dockside, and then waiting for the tools that the RC is apparently developing in cooperation with Wizards of the Coast that will hopefully make it easier for people to find like-minded individuals to play with. And then reassessing whether Jeweled Lotus and or Mana Crypt still even needed a ban. Yeah, I completely agree with what Olivia had wanted to do, but even if she had been the strongest supporter of these bans, even if they had been her idea, she still would not have deserved deserved the harassment, docking attempts, and literal death threats that occurred, and that means no one else deserves that either. This is not, oh, well, her opinion was actually what I agree with, and therefore she should not be threatened. Regardless of her opinion, she should not be threatened, and that goes for everyone else as well, because this barrage of harassment is still going on. Jim has had to lock down his social media accounts. Josh Lee Kwai has resigned from the Commander Advisory Group. I've heard members express concerns about their personal safety at Magic conventions and events because, well, hundreds of people are sending messages encouraging people to confront individuals in person. This is not okay. Do not harass anybody, regardless of whether they were in favor of or against the bans. As the case with Olivia demonstrates, you don't even know who wanted what. People have harassed the Commander Advisory Group, and then it turns out they weren't even aware this was going to happen, let alone involved. Do not harass people. Criticize policy, criticize actions, call out mistakes, but understand the difference between fair criticism and actual harassment, the difference between sharing your thoughts and actively working to make someone not feel safe at a Magic event. Threats of violence and harassment have no place in the discussion or anywhere in the Magic the Gathering community. You have a right to your opinion. You have a right to feel upset about these changes. You even have the right to express how you feel up to a point. And if you lack the ability to identify what that point is, to see where that line is, then it's time for you to log off. I'm not going to harp on about this point any further, but we can't talk about anything else until we talk about this. Nothing else about the bans matter nearly as much as this matters. And now that I've made that clear, we can talk about what happened and what I think about what happened. As I stated at the top of the video, I do believe these bans will result in a better Commander format. However, I also do not believe they were necessary, at least not all at once and not in this way. And while I do firmly believe this will improve the format, I do not believe it will fix it. I've always maintained that Commander is essentially a broken format that only works so long as we all pretend that it works. You simply can't ban things into alignment in a format with this deep of a card pool. The answer is always going to lie in players making better choices when building their decks, and of course, in communicating with their playgroup. And while the Commander Rules Committee's goal of slowing down the format will come to fruition as the result of these bans, it will of course still be possible to accelerate into the mid-game. Mana Vault, an assortment of Moxen, and of course Sol Ring are all still legal. Green decks still have green ramp, but these kinds of fast starts will certainly happen less often. Red decks also suffered a disproportionate blow as the color doesn't have any other accelerant on par with Dockside Extortionist, but decks of all kinds will be slower going forward. Honestly, I believe any given one of the cards banned on Monday were worthy of being banned from a power level standpoint alone. I even believe it's possible that the Commander format will be more fun in 3 or 6 months than it was a week ago. Mana Crypt offers players 2 extra mana every turn for virtually no downside given Commander's high life totals. While both Jeweled Lotus and Dockside Extortionist are cards designed specifically for Commander that are so powerful to the point where I personally wish they'd never been printed at all. That's actually one of my strongest beliefs about all of this. It's not that I feel that Dockside Extortionist, Jeweled Lotus, and obviously Nadu needed to be banned, well, maybe Nadu, but it's more that these cards should never have been made in the first place. Instead of bans, I was much more in favor of reasonably reprinting these cards so that they became affordable. I am a strong believer in players deciding for themselves whether they want to play with cards like Jeweled Lotus. And full disclosure, I actually own 0 Jeweled Lotuses because I hate the design of that card. I hated it when I saw it, hated it for what it does to Commander decks, so my choice was I don't want to play with it. I never advocated for it to be banned, however. Longtime viewers will also remember that my many Many complaints about Dockside Extortionist were of it not being reprinted, that Wizards of the Coast allowed this card that originated in a Commander precon to climb in value to over $80 by not ever reprinting it in any precon ever again, not reprinting it in a standard set at Rare, not even reprinting it in Commander Legends 2, where it would have been both welcome and a flavor win. But the Rules Committee does not control whether or not Wizards of the Coast will reprint a card. However, if we are going to talk about the Rules Committee, I think it is fair to take issue with the way in which these cards were banned. To begin, I find it shocking that the Commander Advisory Group was not consulted about these potential bans. For those not familiar, the Rules Committee is the decision-making body that determines everything from policy to bans, but there is an advisory group of members from many different parts of the Commander community who are meant to assist and advise the Rules Committee. As the Rules Committee itself says, the Commander Advisory Group is there to highlight potential format improvements, discuss the impact of proposed changes, and help the Rules Committee stay in touch with the community. Seems like exactly who you should have discussed the idea of doing such sweeping and unprecedented bans with, and yet the CAG was just as blindsided as the rest of the community, which begs the question, if you're not going to seek advice from your advisory group, what is the point in having an advisory group? In an updated post, the Rules Committee explained that a concern for leaks is what largely kept them from consulting the CAG. Along the same lines of asking what is the point of having an advisory group that you do not seek advice from, I feel it is fair to say that if you cannot trust your advisory group, a group made up of luminaries from the Magic community, from Rachel Weeks to Kristen Gregory to Ben Wheeler, Rachel Agnes, Rebel, Shivam, Tim Willoughby, Josh Lee Kwai, well, not Josh anymore, as following this ban announcement, he stepped down after nearly half a decade on the CAG. To be clear, the reasons behind his resignation are currently known only to him, and no specific issue was cited in his statement of resignation, but regardless, I think it was a huge mistake not to involve the CAG in these decisions, at the very least to hear differing opinions and viewpoints to help guide their decision-making. In regards to the bans themselves, I simply don't believe a massive wave of significant bans is the best way to approach the curation of a non-rotating format with a card pool as deep as Commander. Just because 4 cards are powerful enough to potentially be worth banning still doesn't mean the format needs all 4 cards gone at once, or even at all. Sometimes it only needs a couple taken away for the rest to become less offensive after the new meta shakes out. Look at the recent bannings in Pioneer, for example. Prior to the ban, Pioneer was a 3-deck format. Rakdos Vampires, Abzan Amalia Combo, and Is It Phoenix. When Wizards decided to ban a card each from Rakdos Vampires and Abzan Amalia, many Magic the Gathering players thought this was insufficient to fix the format, as it would only neuter 2 of the 3 oppressive decks. But if you look at the Pioneer metagame today, a month later, the format is wide open. Is It Phoenix is certainly still a good deck, but there are other powerful decks like Rakdos Sacrifice, Azurius Control, 5-color Enigmatic Fires, and several others which have all risen to compete with the Bird Menace. The choice to ban just 2 cards back in August allowed the format to self-correct around the remaining power outlier deck. By that same token, consider the community's reaction if the Rules Committee had chosen to only ban, say, Nadu and Dockside Extortionist on Monday. Sure, some players who owned copies of Dockside Extortionist would have lost value, and certainly some red players would complain that their decks will struggle to keep up against their green opponents. But by and large, the format would adjust, and players would understand. After all, Dockside Extortionist has been a power-level outlier for a while. It's also a unique card. No other single card in Commander generates as much mana as Dockside is capable of making, not even Mana Crypt or Jeweled Lotus. And once you start blinking or bouncing a Dockside to re-trigger it, then, well, I'm sure you've played against a Dockside Extortionist. You know what happens. Banning Nadu and Dockside Extortionist would have been a significant reset to the Commander meta, and I believe it's entirely possible that the frequency of fast starts that the committee highlighted may have self-corrected. In fact, of the mana accelerant trio of Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, and Dockside Extortionist was the most likely to show up at the more casual tables that the Rules Committee is trying to protect. A Rule Zero conversation surrounding zero mana accelerants is much simpler and easier to navigate than a Rule Zero conversation that bars all fast mana of any kind, except Soul Ring is fine, and so are Mana Dorks, and Green Ramp, and Arcane Signet, and Talismans, and so on and so forth. Now, if the Rules Committee wanted to call out Jeweled Lotus and Mana Crypt as potential targets for a future ban, that would have been reasonable as well. They could have gauged community opinion and given players the chance to part way with their Lotuses and Crypts well in advance. Now, in a follow-up article, the committee brought up a couple fair points about watch lists like this. First of all, putting a card on a watch list and then never banning it creates a kind of financial anxiety around that card. The card could still be banned at any point, but maybe it never does. And players would never know for sure. Maybe the players who would want the cards banned would get frustrated at the lack of action. And while this is certainly a possibility, I don't personally believe this potential downside is really as significant as a completely unannounced banning that marks a distinct shift in philosophy. In addition, the committee said that a watch list would push the loss of value onto less enfranchised players who might not be aware of the risk of owning watch list cards. Players who knew a potential banning was coming up could offload their Crypts and Lotuses on unsuspecting players at their local game store. My problem with this line of thinking, though, is that these less enfranchised players are taking a hit no matter what. If they were looking to buy a Mana Crypt or a Jeweled Lotus for their commander deck, then they'd do that anyway, watch list or no. I am of the opinion that more warning is always better for any ban this significant. Consider Wizards of the Coast's B&R announcement from August again. In that article, Wizards highlighted a card in each from Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy that are on the watch list. Treasure Cruise in Pioneer, the One Ring in Modern, and Psychic Frog in Legacy. The One Ring in particular is a $100 card. Many Modern players own 4 copies of this card. These Modern players know the card could get banned out from under them, but they are holding on to them anyway. If the One Ring is banned in the next announcement, these players will know the risk they took by not selling them sooner. Honestly, I feel the notion that the committee couldn't have provided any warning doesn't hold much water, given the previous quarterly rules update in July. In that announcement, the committee mentioned that Nadu was on their radar as a card that could get banned. That's it, just Nadu. So it's not that the Rules Committee is philosophically opposed to warnings about potential bans. They just specifically didn't want to warn about Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, or Dockside Extortionist. That is hard to stomach, given that Nadu was only a $3 card prior to the ban, while the other 3 cards were in the $100 price range and up. Now, I do think in an ideal world, the Rules Committee should not have to take into account card price when making their decisions. If a card is making the format less fun, or less diverse, or fundamentally breaks the game in some way, then it should be banned regardless of whether it's a $3 card or a $100 card. Wizards of the Coast certainly doesn't consider card prices when making decisions about the legality of a format, and I don't think the Rules Committee should have to either, to a certain extent. If a card is clearly an egregious power outlier, then it should go. Dockside Extortionist clearly falls into that category, but Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus don't. Not really. They were 2 of the strongest cards in the format, but they weren't that far removed from Soul Ring or Mana Vault. I consider Soul Ring to be more powerful than both Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus. It therefore does not feel to me like Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus were egregious enough offenders for the committee to not take into account the financial blow that banning them would lead to. And to be clear, I'm very sympathetic to folks who owned copies of the banned cards. And while it's not the committee's fault that these cards were so expensive, I do still think that the financial blow could have and should have carried more weight. Moreover, I am concerned about the fallout that this ban decision will have on one of the more important pillars of the Commander community: trust. This decision marks a significant shift in ban philosophy by the Rules Committee. Prior to September 23rd, Commander players had grown to expect a certain hands-off approach to the Commander ban list. It seemed as though the committee was content with the buffer provided by Rule Zero conversations and the natural capacity for casual Commander tables to self-regulate. There were exceptions, of course. Cards like Hullbreacher and Golos received bans due to egregiously unfun play patterns and restriction of format diversity. But for the most part, based on prior history, players assumed that their expensive mana rocks were staples of the format, as untouchable in Commander as Brainstorm and Wasteland are in Legacy or Fetchlands are in Modern. Were these cards clearly some of the best in the format? Yes, of course. But there were enough of these kinds of cards in the format that had remained legal for long enough that it's no wonder that players assumed these cards were relatively safe to spend money on. After last Monday, that's no longer true. Going forward, Commander players have a new factor to take into account when considering whether or not to buy that next new expensive Commander product. After all, these were cards that were either specifically designed with Commander in mind or were used to promote products to Commander players who might otherwise ignore a set. Jeweled Lotus was on the box art for Commander Masters just over a year ago, and as recently as last December, Mana Crypt was used to push Lost Caverns of Ixalan's sealed product. So I completely understand why someone would feel like a rug has been pulled out from under them. I'm sure this shift in philosophy would be easier for players to stomach if it felt consistent. Unfortunately, the announcement did not offer much consistency. The section on why Sol Ring remained legal undercut the legitimacy of the previous sections. The committee wrote, based on our own criteria, Sol Ring should be banned, but we don't want to do that, because banning Sol Ring would fundamentally change the identity of the format. This pair of sentences completely undermines the justification for banning the other two mana rocks. All the same arguments applied to Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus could also be applied to Sol Ring. What's more, defending Sol Ring on the basis of not changing the identity of the format is, quite frankly, nonsense, given that the existing bans already diverges from the committee's long-standing approach to the legality of the strongest mana rocks. Yeah, we all know why Sol Ring wasn't banned. It's a $1 card that everyone can easily acquire, and more importantly, it's in virtually every single precon. Banning Sol Ring would invalidate every Commander precon, not just in existence today, but also any future precon that's already in production. But neither of these reasons were named in that article. Instead, the reasons provided were reasons that could just as easily be applied to Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus. Sol Ring is the iconic card of the format. Jeweled Lotus literally only works in Commander. And don't go running to the comments to tell me about the Legacy Doubling Cube deck. You know what I mean by this. The fact that Sol Ring remains legal while cards like Coalition Victory, Primeval Titan, and Sylvan Primordial remain banned is philosophically incoherent. It's hard to put your faith in the committee's decision-making when it is difficult to follow their rationale, just as it is also difficult to follow their rationale in not better consulting their own Commander advisory group. At the end of the day, my hope is that the Rules Committee adjusts their approach to future ban announcements based on what happened here. This is a learning moment if ever there was one. Hopefully, future high-impact bans do not come without any semblance of warning. I also hope the committee can begin to articulate their thought process in a way that instills more faith in their decisions. I hope that this week hasn't done significant damage to the committee's reputation, nor caused too many Commander players to walk away from Magic's most popular format. And despite all of these mistakes and missteps, I still truly believe that these bans can make Commander more fun in the long term. I'll be holding out hope for that. I am saddened by the loss of value, but I'm much more frustrated at Wizards of the Coast for allowing their game pieces to balloon to the prices that they did than I am at the committee for doing what they felt was best for the health of Commander. As for the community, well, this week has been really hard to witness as someone who loves this game and who loves the people who play it. The level of vitriol on social media, in the comments of content creators' videos, in the DMs of committee members, it's all extremely disappointing, and it's morally reprehensible. No, ultimately, I do not agree with the decision made last Monday, nor do I agree with the way in which it was carried out. The committee themselves weren't even in unanimous agreement there. But at the end of the day, none of that matters when people are being harassed and threatened for doing their job. an unpaid volunteer job at that. There are ways to make your concerns known that are constructive and that lead to a better game and community in the long term. I'm asking you, one human being to another, please don't be a part of the problem. And with that, I cautiously ask, what are your thoughts on these bans? Do you agree with some of them, all of them, or none of them at all? Let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to cleanse your palate of the drama and just enjoy people playing Commander and having fun, why not check out an episode of Shuffle Up and Play? Our newest episode features Wubby, Batty, and Lewis Stardust, or flip back a few episodes and watch our game with Ristic Studies, Voxy, and Spencer Crittenden. Let's all remember that Commander is a fun game that you play with friends, new and old. Let's celebrate and embrace that.